Okay, let's talk about America's foreign policy from 1877 to 1912. Make a note that this is also occurring during the same period as the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. So this is yet another layer of activity that's occurring in the United States. Let me begin by first giving you a summary of some of the motives that helped encourage American imperialism. In order to meet wartime demands during the Civil War, industry had expanded tremendously in the United States. By the end of the 1890s, the frontier had also closed. American industrialists began to look abroad for new markets and investment opportunities. At the turn of the century, the U.S. began to extend its control into Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as other areas in the Pacific. American imperialist ventures were justified by the concept of the white man's burden and the civilizing mission. America's foreign policy in some ways mirrors European imperialism, except for they are targeting different regions of the world. Europeans are mostly imperializing places like India, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. The United States turns its attention to Latin America and some areas in the Pacific. So we have to backtrack just a little bit to start with the first acquisition that the United States makes. In 1867, the United States brokered a deal where they purchased Alaska from the Russians. This deal was brokered by William Seward, and it was known as Seward's Folly. Folly means joke. Most Americans had no idea why the United States was interested in purchasing a frozen tundra located in the northwest corner of North America. It later becomes the 49th state, and as we all know, Alaska has been strategic in terms of military and also in the wealth of resources that Alaska contains. The second imperialist venture that the United States undertakes is also driven by the need for new markets and for more resources. And this is going to be in Hawaii and involve Queen Liliuokalani, who is more affectionately known as Queen Lily. In 1893, a small group of sugar and pineapple growers who were also sponsored by large businesses, such as the one run by Sanford B. Dole, they were accompanied by an American minister to Hawaii and were backed by the United States Army, Navy, and government. The U.S. government and Army and Navy at first were there unofficially, just backing a U.S. private venture. However, the businessmen led by men such as Dole wanted to depose the Queen in order to take over control of Hawaii and be able to have more control over its sugar and fruit production. Subsequently, these businessmen, backed by the U.S. government and Army and Navy, imprisoned the Queen and seized approximately 2 million acres of Hawaii's land and conspired to annex the islands. On January 17, 1893, the U.S. government, led by these businessmen, announced the overthrow of the Queen's government. To avoid bloodshed, Queen Lily yielded her sovereignty and called upon the U.S. government to, quote, undo the actions of its representatives, end quote. But the U.S. government refused to help her regain the throne. As it sent troops onto the shores of Hawaii, they were met by resistance from the Hawaiian natives. As we've seen in many cases, the bigger, stronger nation used this as a justification to then go in, put down the rebellion, and seize power. Queen Lily essentially lived the rest of her life under a form of house arrest, and when she died in 1917, Hawaii was an American territory. In 1959, after Alaska, Hawaii became the 50th state of the United States. America's largest imperial gains were made during the Spanish-American War in 1898. This war only lasted about 4 months, and Ambassador and later Secretary of State John Hay wrote to Theodore Roosevelt and declared that from start to finish it had been a splendid little war. He said this because in just a short period of time, the U.S. had gained a lot of territory, not necessarily states or colonies, but territories where they exerted a vast amount of influence, both economically and politically, and that overall very little life was shed, at least on the U.S. end. The American public had to get behind these efforts, and in order to do so, they used the likes of newspapermen such as William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. Also in your IDs, I have listed E.W. Scripps. These three guys all owned huge newspapers in the golden age of newspapers, and these newspapers were famous for what was called yellow journalism. It's in the muckraker family in that it's supposed to be investigative, but it has more of a sensationalized nature, and in many ways propagated the cause of the U.S. government and its intervention into some of these Latin American and Pacific areas. To boil it down, it's like this: there were already European powers in place in all of these places, and the natives wanted freedom and to be liberated, particularly from the Spanish. So the United States, through yellow journalism and propaganda, convinced the American people that it was in the best interest of the natives in each of these places to go in and help them gain their independence from the oppressive Spanish rule that they had been under. The most famous example of yellow journalism was the sinking of the battleship USS Maine, which occurred in the Havana harbor. It was a second-class battleship that was built in the late 1880s and early 1890s and was sent to Havana in January of 1898 to protect American interest during the long-standing revolt of the Cubans against the Spanish government. So this is going along with what I just said. So in some ways we were serving as a watchdog there on behalf of the Cubans and guarding our own economic interest in Cuba. On February the 15th, 1898, the USS Maine exploded and sank into the Havana harbor, and 3/4 of the battleship's crew died as a result. Spain was blamed for the attack and for the explosion and deaths of these sailors. In reality, it was probably not Spain who attacked the USS Maine, but rather some kind of internal problem that the U.S. or malfunction that the USS Maine had. But nevertheless, Spain was blamed, and the U.S. government, along with some of these newspapermen, published lots of articles that helped to unite popular opinion behind the idea that the United States should declare war on Spain. And war was in fact declared just a few months later. The war was declared using the Teller Amendment. The Teller Amendment was introduced by Senator Henry Teller of Colorado in 1898 to declare war on Spain. Just as a side note, I wanted to give you a quick view of what kinds of fortunes these newspapermen were able to amass. This is known as the Hearst Castle. This is located in California, built with the riches that he gained from mass media and print journalism. Now the Spanish-American War actually included lots of different locations, but the main location in this first part was in Cuba, and this is where we're going to see the emergence of Teddy Roosevelt, not as a political figure yet, but as a cavalry leader and commander who led a group known as the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders were a group of cavalry volunteers, mostly made up of ranchers and cowboys from the West, And Teddy Roosevelt resigned from his post as the Assistant Secretary to the Navy in order to enter active fighting. Their biggest contribution was in the Battle of San Juan Hill, which occurred in July of 1898, which was at the height of the Spanish-American War. The American troops actually defeated the Spanish, and the Rough Riders were seen as an integral part of this. Many scholars argue that the Rough Riders actually didn't have that much to do with the Battle of San Juan Hill or have that great of an impact. But this image of Teddy Roosevelt not only is based on the myth of the cowboy and the Wild West that at this time is also fading away, but it's going to give him the status as a war hero, and then once he gets back, he will rise very quickly politically to become the vice president of William McKinley in his second term, and then after McKinley is assassinated, he is going to become the president and lead the second half of American imperialism. Remember, Mark Hanna, another newspaper man, said after McKinley was shot, he was not a Teddy fan, and he said, well, we just made that damn cowboy president. And I need to draw a distinction here between a couple of things. The Spanish-American War involved Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. And this is, again, where the United States is fighting Spain in order to help liberate these peoples. What you find afterwards is that then the United States plans on having a great amount of influence in all of these places, and in some cases entertains the idea of annexing them, making them territories, or making them states. Guam and Puerto Rico today are still territories of the United States and have an interesting relationship where they can still vote in primaries and presidential elections, and they can also hold a U.S. passport. As I mentioned, Cuba was the main part of the Spanish-American War, but the other part was out in the Pacific and dealt with the Philippines. Now there are two halves to this. The first is the Spanish-American War, where the United States helps to defeat the Spanish, and they ally with the Filipinos. But then following that, you have a separate conflict that involves the United States, and it's known as the Philippine-American War. And this is once the Filipinos realize that the United States has kicked out the Spanish in order to take over themselves, the natives then turn and fight the United States. And this is going to be in 1899. They were glad to be free of Spanish rule, but they did not want to trade their old colonial power, Spain, for a new imperial one, which was the United States. The war between the Filipinos and the Americans will last until 1902. So this is going to go beyond just the Spanish-American War. But make that distinction. The Spanish-American War does involve the Philippines, but then the United States has to follow up and fight another war against the Filipino natives. As you remember, when we talked about populism and used the Wizard of Oz as a populist analogy, in the book, they talked about the characters of the Yellow Winkies, and those were seen as the Filipinos. Frank Baum actually pointed out, quote, "It isn't the people who live in a country who know the most about it. Look at the Filipinos. Everybody knows more about their country than they do." What you're going to see throughout this whole thing, but particularly comments made about the Philippines, show the United States also employing the white man's burden and the civilizing mission. According to President William McKinley, the U.S. annexation of the Philippines after the Spanish-American War was necessary in order to, quote, "educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them." Andrew Carnegie, on the other hand, said, "You seem to have about finished your work civilizing the Filipinos. 8,000 of them have been civilized and sent to heaven. I hope you like it." This is commenting on the Philippine-American War that happened after the Spanish-American War. And so that ends the Spanish-American War. The treaty that ends this is the Treaty of Paris. And next up we have Teddy Roosevelt, who ascends to the presidency, and the beginning of the Panama Canal.